Ladies and gentlemen, now we will continue to the next session. However, before we move further to the next agenda, the committee would like to thank our general sponsor for the 5th Literary Studies Conference 2017.
And the sponsors are English Extension Course Universitas Sanata Dharma, Lesung Batik, Lembaga Bahasa Universitas Sanata Dharma, and Bookshop Universitas Sanata Dharma. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are continuing to the next meeting, which is to hear our first plenary session from our very own English Letter Department lecturer, Dr. Elisabeth Arti Wulandari from Sanata Dharma University. And the first plenary session will be moderated by Dr. Novita Dewi.
Bu Novi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ugo and Joyce. Very good morning to you all. It is my pride and pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Elisabeth Arti Wulandari. When Bu Arti came here around 20 years ago, she's just the smartest and youngest lecturer ever. And within a matter of 2 or 3 years, she obtained the Fulbright scholarship to study comparative literature at Cornell University. Such an achievement back then. And she secured her first MA in 2003. She could have just continued her study to get her PhD, but Sanata Dharma needed her. She had to return because we need to have fine lecturers to teach both Indonesian and English, and also literature. So she was engaged in various activities, academics and non-academic alike. And even in 2006, when the earthquake hit Jogja, for instance, Bu Arti then took the initiative to conduct a puppet travel performances around villages that was affected by the earthquake. And the puppet show that you have just seen was actually touchingly scripted by Bu Arti, so please give an applause to her. And then she secured another scholarship, Fulbright scholarship in 2006 to continue her study. This time, the same subject, comparative literature, but this time she took it in University of Wisconsin, and she finished it in 2 years, her second MA. And she was so much involved in the activity with the Wisconsin University, and she forgot to return probably. And she stayed there engaging in various activities while finishing her PhD. And I took notice of the awards and also scholarship that she obtained throughout her stay in the United States. Almost half of her academic career, maybe around 13 awards from teaching and writing, publishing, and even talent scouting for voice and acting, yeah, for the video program in Bahasa Indonesia. So she did that. So she acted like the jury in Voice or Indonesian Idol, American Idol, talent scouting all these talented young men and women to perform in the textbook. And yet she didn't forget to also nurture her hobby that is in photography. Well, when you finish attending this conference for the whole 3 days, please 2 days, spend time to look at YouTube or Public Radio of Wisconsin and also Life magazine, Grow magazine, Life Science for Life, and you will see a lot of shots taken by Bu Arti. My favorite is the family of fox that are very nice and featured in magazine and YouTube. That was the work of our fine Bu Arti expertise in photography. And don't you forget that her utmost interest is in performances. That is why it became the basis of her dissertation, a very finely written dissertation. The title is "The Right to Perform," the right to perform, performing the right. The city that was the performances from 3 countries: Indonesia, India, and South America. As a result, she mastered several languages: Japanese for sure, Indonesian, English, and Hindi a little bit, yeah, and then maybe Spanish. You wish, yeah? And today we are going to listen to her talk, and this time we travel. The textual mobility is really mobile here because now she travels to Indonesia. Looking at our eminent writer, Hadini, and Bu Arti will examine her works, and then we will see how she combined all the theory and practices that she gained from her study here and also in the United States. So with that, I conclude. I could go on and on and on to read the biography of Bu Arti, because there are many published articles, but I don't think the time permits me. So I will stop there, and now let us gear up and listen to Bu Arti's talk. And I gave you all the liberty to take the whole maybe 30 minutes, yeah, Ibu, and we'll see, because we have a good 1 hour until 10 o'clock or maybe 10 o'clock plus for QA. All right, so I give you the floor, Bu Arti. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Elisabeth Arti Wulandari.
Thank you so much, Ibu Novi, for the very kind introduction. And I don't know if I can live up to your expectation now. I hope you don't expect so much from this talk this morning. And I have to clarify, the performance that you just saw is mostly the work of the students. So I just no, actually I just gave them the just kind of the push, like, to do this and that, but everything is done by them. So all the credits should go to them. So anyway, so today I'm going to talk about this belonging, exile, and the world of in-between, figures of displacement in the novel by Hadini pada Sebuah Kapal, and a puppet theater performance by a local Jogja puppet theater company called Paper Moon Puppet Theater, and I'm looking at their play called Secangkir, Kopi, dari Playa. But before we begin, let me start by sharing with you a personal story. Actually, it just came to me yesterday morning while I was eating, sambal, talking about the combination of sambal and, like kind of repressed memory. So actually, my grandfather, we don't know whether he's still alive or whether he passed away already, but the last time we saw him was about in 1993, or if I'm not mistaken. At that time, he came with the group, the gamelan group from Singapore. So how did he end up in Singapore? So in the 1945, he was, according to my grandma, he was forced to work as indentured labor, by the Japanese. So they brought him to Singapore. And after that, there's no communication between him and my grandmother. And my grandmother, she lived in Sleman, and it was like, they lived really poorly at that time. She had 2 kids at that time. And so there's no word from my grandfather. So then she married another man and had another son. But when the son was only a baby, my grandfather suddenly showed up, right? And of course he was upset and he was sad knowing that my grandma already married someone else. So then he decided to leave the village forever, and we never heard from him again, except after 1965 through my father received a letter, and then finally we saw him the first time in the 1990s. So in a way, that talking about, I am not a diasporic subject, I don't think I am, I don't know. The theme of the conference kind of speak personally to me in a sense. So I want to start by sharing with you a poem that I wrote around 9 or 8 years ago in the middle of winter in Wisconsin. And for this, I will ask Ibu Fenty. She will read the poem in Indonesian, and I can show you the translation in English. Ibu Fenty.
Elisabeth Arti Wulandari. Aku merasa asing di sini, dikala salju menyelimuti kota. Ku ingat dulu waktu aku sekolah di desa. Setiap Senin, tegak, siap upacara naik bendera, lantang anak nyanyikan Indonesia Raya, Pancasila hafal luar kepala. Ku tumbuh dalam gempita musik dangdut, keroncong, gamelan dan MTV, gebiar layar wayang kulit, Sri Mulat, ketoprak, dongeng tentang hantu di pohon kemiri ujung gang, Rambo dan Superman berteman dengan Gatot Kaca dan Sri Kandi dari Mahabharata, Salhaswan, Winnetou, Donald Bebek, Putri Salju dan Cinderella, ikan asin, sayur tempe, warung gudeg dan teh nasgidel di pinggir pasar, selamatan mobil tetangga dengan potongan 1/8 telur bulat bundar untuk bocah-bocah, atau McDonald dan KFC di Yogyakarta, pasar bersemut orang di sudut mall yang hadir janggal, parfum wangi merebak dan pengemis menunggu recehan rupiah. Mengapa aku rindu dengan keributan dan kekacauan yang manis itu? Di sini aku sepi. Di tengah lautan putih dan pohon-pohon yang merana, aku merasa asing. Seorang pintar berujar, bahasa adalah rumah bagi jiwa. Sedang lidahku keluh oleh kata-kata yang bapakku tidak mengerti. Bahasa yang bukan rumahku berteduh, hanya rumah singgah di mana aku tetap tamu yang asing. Toh di setiap bandara aku harus tunjukkan buku kecil penanda diriku sebagai yang kebetulan lahir di tanah ibuku. Toh ada secari kertas ajaib bertanda nama yang tidak kukenal dan tidak pernah kutemui. Toh, tanpanya aku tidak bisa tinggal di negeri asing ini. Tapi, toh aku memilih datang ke sini. Tapi toh aku mencari gempita yang lain ini. Tapi toh aku menikmati juga lautan putih ini. Dan toh aku juga jatuh cinta pada pohon-pohon yang merana di luar kamarku ini. Dan toh aku mengejar mimpi yang selalu kulihat di majalah, layar film dan televisi. Aku memilih pergi kemana mimpi-mimpi itu berasal. Aku memilih untuk datang seperti musafir. Inilah perjalananku. Laki-laki tua renta yang pernah kutemui 2-3 kali itu, kakekku yang asing dan jauh. Karena di bawah tuan negeri matahari terbit, dipekerjakan di negeri asing, sepertiku tinggalkan desa tempatnya lahir. Apakah dia juga kapai-kapai yang mabuk dijerat oleh neon-neon sepanjang jalan di negeri bikinan Tuan Jenderal Raffles? Gemerlapnya lampu-lampu di sana pasti lebih terang daripada kunang-kunang di sawah kakek buyutnya dan lampu-lampu minyak di desa, di mana istri dan anaknya menunggu dalam kemiskinan yang menyesak. Salahkah jika dia tidak kembali, terus mengejar terang neon-neon lampu sentosa? Tidakkah kini dan nanti, waktu tiba saatnya kembali, aku sedang dan sudah berubah? Tidakkah keributan dan kekacauan yang manis dulu akan ikut berubah? Tidakkah warung gudeg itu mungkin akan menjelma menjadi toko roti? Tidakkah juga aku akan merasa asing di rumahku sendiri? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Fenty. You made the poem sound much better than what is written there. And forgive, I'm sorry for the English translation. It's kind of like rushly done. So anyway, so the poem that I wrote about 10 years ago in the dead winter of Madison, Wisconsin, contains some of the notion that I want to highlight in my talk today about feeling at home and about homeland and hostland, about displacement and displaced people, about longing for a lost home and desire to belong somewhere else, about being caught in between two worlds and the ambivalence that comes from occupying this in-between space. So in this presentation, I attempt to examine these concepts through two works. The first is a novel by N. Hardini, and another one is the puppet show by the amazing Jogja Puppet Theatre group, Paper Moon Puppet Theatre. But before I present my analysis to these two works, I'd like to go over with you some important concepts that I will use in my presentation, including home, what constitutes diaspora and diasporic studies, and what is diasporic literature, and I would really appreciate later your feedback and your thought on this. And I will end my presentation later with suggestions for further research. So diasporic literature often explores ambivalence that haunts diasporic communities between longing for a lost homeland and desire of belonging to a new adopted land or host land. Diasporic subjects are often portrayed as caught in between both lands that do not welcome that ache of belonging or longing, often forced to leave their homeland into exile because of socio-cultural, economic, or political reasons. Diasporic people can be said to occupy a liminal space, to use Homi Bhabha's term. Although most experience of exile means being displaced and uprooted, and thus seen as disempowerment, occupying and embracing the in-between space can be empowering. My presentation interrogates this question of belonging, exile, and embracing the in-between space in two literary works. In the first, in Hardini's novel Pada Sebuah Kapal, we find a protagonist named Sri who finds freedom to love again and to find herself again in the international waters in between Java, her homeland, and France, her adopted land. The second one is Secangkir, Kopi, dari, Playa, a puppet theater from Paper Moon Puppet Theater. The play, set in one of the darkest chapters in Indonesian history, the events of 1965 chaos, is based on a true story about Pak Wi, a man forced into a 40-year-long exile in the Soviet and then in Cuba. Performed in an antique shop surrounded by things of the past that are imbued with memories and nostalgia, the play accentuates Pak Wi's resilience and steadfast hope despite the lost love because of exile. Sri and Pak Wi, with their story of exile and belonging, are diasporic figures who are, despite being figures of displacement, embrace their world of in-between to find empowerment and voice in the liminal space. But before I move on to my analysis, just very quickly, what is diaspora, right? So kind of just to set the dialogue for today's conference and tomorrow. So let's see how William Safran, James Clifford, and Roger Brubaker have defined this. To me, it's a rather elusive terms, right? So William Safran, he said that diaspora is expatriate minority communities. And then he talks about 6 features of diasporic community, right? First, that they or their ancestors have been dispersed from a specific original center to 2 or more peripheral or foreign regions. They retain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland. They believe that they are not and probably cannot be fully accepted by their host society and therefore feel partially alienated and insulated from it. They regard their ancestral homeland as their true ideal home and as the place which they or their descendants would or should eventually return, and that they believe they should collectively be committed to the maintenance and restoration of their original homeland and to its safety and prosperity. And they continue to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another. So James Clifford summarizing Safran, so he talks about this. So we have in Safran is history of dispersal, myth or memories of the homeland, alienation in the host land, that host country, desire for eventual return, ongoing support of the homeland, and collective identity, importantly, defined by this relationship. Right? And then later on, Roger Brubaker kind of trying to simplify this. So he talks about 3 criterions, what constitutes a diaspora, right? Dispersion in space, so that's the first one, relating to Safran's first feature. Orientation to a homeland, right? So that's like the myth and then the desire for eventual return and ongoing support of the homeland. That is the orientation to a homeland. But we have to know whether that this is not just about real homeland, it can be both real and imagined. And this homeland, whether real or imagined, became this authoritative source of value, identity, and loyalty. And the last one is boundary maintenance, right? It's about this collective identity, involving the preservation of a distinctive identity vis-a-vis a host society. If it sounds a little bit essentializing, I think we have to kind of move away from that, right? So we are talking about identity, but not in the essentialist sense. So Brubaker later brings Stuart Hall's, right, idea of hybridity. So Stuart Hall is the most quoted, one of his most quoted line. He says, the diaspora experience is defined not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, the conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity. Right? So we have to think of that. So there is no one single, let's say, Indonesian diasporic community. Even when you talk about Indonesian diasporan community in the United States, for example, there's no one single identity to talk about the whole Indonesian identity. So Brubaker proposes to treat diaspora not as a bounded entity, but as an idiom, a way of expression, whether that appears in literary work, performance, or in writings, as a trope, probably, like that sense of lost home, or the story of, of this ambivalent toward both worlds, etc. But also, diaspora is a claim and is a stance. So it is something that you have to perform. I'm reading it as that way. Something that you have to perform. But I'm not using like just completely postmodernist idea of performance, identity as something that completely performance. No, I think it's also there's a sense of the interpellation from another subject, and the interpellation is either from the host land or from the homeland, right? And I'm using Althusserian terms of interpellation or hailing. So you also become a diasporic subject, because it's not just about how you perform yourself, but also that you are hailed, that you are called upon. And we can see this example later when we talk about Indonesian network diaspora. So Brubaker continues, sorry, I forgot the page number, that diaspora is a way of formulating the identities and loyalties of population. So who then has the right to formulate this identity? It is either the people from that community, or someone else, someone from outside, or maybe a scholar that speaks in behalf of that community. And I think for this conference we will have a lot of examples talking about Indonesian, diasporic literature, and I'm looking forward to the presentation from Ibu Liango in that subject. So we can think of, so Butler's 5 dimension of the diaspora studies helps me to think about what about Indonesian diaspora, right? And again, I will really appreciate your thoughts later, right? So we have to think of the reasons for and conditions of the dispersal, the kind of relationship that the diasporic community have with the homeland, the relationship with the host land, the interrelationship within communities of the diaspora, and the example I put in there. And then comparative studies of different diasporas. And I think this is where we can do a lot. So I hope that it becomes an invitation for us later to do this kind of comparative studies of different Indonesian diasporas. But before we talk about that, because I promised that we should talk about home first, right? So I want to emphasize that I'm talking about home not just, as the physical home, but as Sommerfeld quoted in Chabai and Siu Lun, home has 7 dimensions. Home as a shelter, hearth, privacy, roots, abode, and paradise. So home as both real but also imagined, right? And again, for the diasporic subject, this homeland is both that, in both senses, the real and the imagined. And so when I'm trying to think about Indonesian diaspora from the criteria of reasons for and conditions of the dispersal, right? Even though I mentioned that, I'm trying to invite you to think of diasporic more as a kind of this performance and stuff like that. But I think to look back at the condition, the first conditions or reasons for that dispersal will help us to kind of see where or what we can do in this field of study. So based on this, and again, please add later, think about the endangered laborers under the Dutch colonial administration, right? The Javanese in Suriname. Think about the exile of the Moluccans, right? Who were Khmer soldiers, right? But here, I don't know if I'm wading in in this troubled sea, because we are talking about a separatist group, our supporters of the separatist groups. And then think about the 1965 political exiles, right? They are spread in China, Russia, Vietnam, and then later on in Europe. And think about the 1998 after the May riots. And then think about migrant workers. So what the students tried to present to you earlier is a story about anak oleh-oleh, or souvenir child. So this is about children of migrant workers who either they married other migrant workers from another country when they overseas, or whether they were raped by employers or other migrant workers. And I think from CNN we learned there are about maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, 500 so-called anak oleh-oleh. And there is an NGO that is trying to help them, because a lot of time the anak oleh-oleh, some of the parents have to leave them in their village, like what is depicted in the performance, because the parents or the mother particularly has to go overseas again in order to eke out a living, to make a living, right? And of course, the migrant workers is not just after 1998, I put it that way, but and then with migrant workers, I'm not just talking about TKI and TKW, but also about expats, Indonesian expats, so people with higher positions in companies, big companies, and the people that you hear in the Indonesian diaspora network. So just very quickly, the Javanese is Suriname. So I'm reading this article from Inside Indonesia. There are over 70,000 Javanese that live in Suriname, right? So they were brought there as endangered laborers, and they maintain their Javanese culture strongly. They even speak a creolized version of Javanese language, and that Javanese culture have also influenced the Caribbean nations' culture there. And you may remember that a Suriname minister, is she a minister? She visited Jokowi and they spoke Javanese, so that's really interesting. So they came there in around 1980s to 1939, almost 33,000 at that time, right? And only 20% to 25% then returned to Java before the Second World War. Most of them stayed there, right? And in this diasporic community, we have a strong cultural continuity. Even to the second and later generations, they still identify with their country of origin. And demographically, Javanese compose about 1/3 of the population there. Now, what about the Moluccans in the Netherlands? And again, those who know more, because I'm not familiar with this, right? Please let me know whether we can talk about them as part of the Indonesian diaspora, or maybe because they want not to have anything with Indonesia. I mean, they want more about Moluccan identity and not Indonesian identity. Maybe this is not something that I should put in there. So let me know what you think, right? So they were former KNIL soldiers who were stationed on Java and Sumatra, right? And then after the independence war in 1950s, they were brought to the Netherlands, right? And the government, the Dutch government, placed 4,000 soldiers with their wives and children, in total approximately 12,500 individuals, ironically enough, in the former German concentration camps. That's from the article, right? What is interesting about this Moluccan diaspora is the kind of radicalism that they have. I mean, they're particularly the first and the second generation, right? They derived their identity on the RMS ideal. They even did some so-called, terrorist activities, resorted to violent actions in their search for, kind of support or trying to be noticed in the news, or maybe not just that. I'm oversimplifying, right? So in 1970s, a small group of young Moluccan extremists turned to violence in a protest for the upcoming visit by Suharto, right? So they occupied the residence of the Indonesian ambassador, stormed their way in, and killed a Dutch policeman. And then this happened again in 1975. They hijacked a train. 3 civilians were killed. And then 1977, they took hostage of a school and they seized a government building in 1978. That's the second generation of the Moluccans, right? So this desire to kind of not just for the betterment for the people, the Moluccan that is still in the Moluccas, but that they wanted independence, right? So that's why I'm kind of hesitant to call it Indonesian diaspora. But the third generation seemed to have shifted their idea, right? The third generation, they have this emotional connection, but they shifted no longer about violent action or so much political activities, but more about social activities. They want to make better the lives of the Moluccans in the Moluccas. So that's the Moluccas diaspora, right? What about 1965? In the 1965 is actually an important context for the two works that I'm going to I'm going to present to you today, right? So, 1965, not 065. On the eve of September 6, 1965, more than 2,000 Indonesians were in the USSR. Several hundreds did not go home, right? About 500 Indonesians happened to be in Beijing. The character that I'm presenting from Secangkir Kopi, dari Playa, a cup of coffee from Playa, is about this. He was a student sent to study in the USSR, but he couldn't go home because of the 1965 event. Right. So after 1970s, 1980s, many of them moved to Europe. And then here the question is, when we talk about literature produced by these political exiles, such as Sobron Aidit, Hershri, I forgot the name right now, right? I mean, we usually talk about it as sastra exile, but I think we can also talk about it in terms of the diasporic literature with another qualifier, right? And the provisional bibliography right now says there are about 133 books, and there's a strong idiom of the idiom that you can find there is this fascination for the home country. Even though, there is, they are exiles and it's a forced exile, but there is a deep desire to go back to their home country. There's a picture of some of these exiles with Susi Pujiastuti, which many of us admire. This is just recently. Now, what about 1998 riots, right? We have not so many literatures using that in, set in 1998. But if you are interested, there is a trilogy Sukram by Sapari Djoko Damono, and there's a brief mention about what happened in the airport, right? A lot of people trying to run away. Seno Gumiro Aji Dharma, who came to our campus last month, was it last month or 2 months ago? He wrote also a play, Clara, atau wanita yang diperkosa, Clara, or a woman who was raped, referring to a Chinese Indonesian woman who was raped in 1998, May 1998. Eka Kurniawan's short story presents a very interesting story. 1998 is not very, it's subtle in there. Gerimis yang sederhana, and I think just the title itself, Gerimis yang sederhana, this image of, gerimis, because it can bring, in mind the kind of sadness, but also it can be a little bit elating in the sense, because the story is not so sad. It ends with the female character laughing, right, under the rain, just remembering. At first, she tried to block her memory of Jakarta, but meeting this man from Jakarta, and then she remembered little things about, little silly things that Indonesian men do, things like that. So there's still that kind of desire also, not desire, this memory of the homeland that has done very bad to her. Right? And another one is that one. And then the last one I want to talk about in terms of Indonesian diaspora very quickly is the Indonesia Diaspora Network. And they just did their 4th Congress with Barack Obama as their keynote speaker. But when I browsed in their website, to me, what is highlighted there is more kind of the success stories of Indonesians abroad. I cannot find any significant discussion of the 1965 diasporic community or people of the exiles, 1965 political exiles, nor the 1998. The focus is more on their trying to negotiate with the government to give dual citizenship, or that the government is trying to lure, the successful Indonesians to return back to Indonesia to build Indonesia, right? Just talking a little bit about what's the number, and the numbers varies depending on the source that you look at. From 1,800,000 up to 8 million diaspora, right, Indonesians. I don't think we will know for sure how many, right? But if you are talking about Indonesian-born population overseas, then you can have kind of more exact number there. And that's from the United Nations. So, but what about diasporic literature? If we remember that 5 criteria, is it literature by diasporic people? Is it literature coming from the diaspora, from, let's say, from the Netherlands, from Suriname? Or is it literature about, or that is concerned with diaspora, or with diasporic experience? And I want to say that all of them, right? We don't want to kind of limit it to just by people of the diaspora. And I think actually I'm using that for the text that I'm looking at. And Hardini traveled, is a world traveler. She lived in the US, she lived in France, she lived in so many places, right? Sorry. And she is a prolific writer, so many works, including this Pada Sebuah Kapal, 1973. What is it about? It's about the story of Sri, right? A Javanese woman. She was proposed by youth, she refused him, in love with Saputra, right? The true love, slept with him before they got married, but then he died in an accident, and that's like, she seems to present herself sometimes as a modern woman, yet that memory of her already losing her virginity is haunting her, right? She's pursued by Carl, a rich man from America, but she decided to marry a French diplomat. And then that marriage is not a happy marriage. She falls for a shipment aboard a ship to Paris, right? I'm not doing the novel a justice, right? But what I want to see is, what I want to argue is that we can look at the ship as an in-between space where Sri lets herself free, right? She can only do that because she is not in Java, even though she idealizes it, right? I want to read the novel as a metaphor for diasporic experience, right? So we can read, I'm reading Saputra as this idealized homeland. Saputra embodies whatever is good about Java, right? Very fine, very halus. And then you have Charles, right? Embodying what is not so good about hostland, with his treatment of her, with him shouting at her and not treating her well. But also there is Michelle, or Michael, I don't know how to say the name, kind of a positive face of the hostland. And Sri is caught in these two worlds, or even three embodiments of these three ideals, right? But I want to see that her being caught in there also liberates her. So we don't have to see that only as one-sided, as a place of displacement. She is being uprooted. No, but by going away, she's also finding herself. Secangkir Kopi dari Playa is kind of similar story about lost love. This is by Paper Moon Puppet Theatre, founded in 2006 by Ria and Iwan Effendi. And they use an art form usually we associate with children's stories, right? But they turn it into a powerful vehicle to address serious social themes, such as sexuality in their 2008 performance, in the 1965 tragedy Muatirika, in 2010, and Secangkir Kopi dari Playa. And I really suggest that you watch Muatirika. It was just wonderful. Secangkir Kopi dari Playa, I didn't see the live performance, but I saw Muatirika in live performance, and it was just equally wonderful. And the group is really has already a prominent place, I think, not just in the Indonesian theater scene, but also abroad, and they have toured in many places. So what is the story about? And so I'm just showing you some stills from the performance, right? It's about this, the focus is on this cup of coffee that the woman, the fiancé used to make for the guy. Oops, sorry. Right? And they spend time together, falling in love and stuff. But then he was sent to the USSR, so he had to leave her, right? And then, so they communicated with letters and stuff like that. But then 1965 happened, so time flew, And I like this. And it's not just about me and you. It's not only about how I feel for you. So what is it about, right? I like to show you a clip, but we don't have much time. Maybe when we have time later. What is so special about this is, I think, the performance practice. So it was a site-specific performance. I performed it in an antique shop, right? So you are already given like the sense of nostalgia. Right? You're surrounded by things of the past. So we are brought there. And then what is interesting also is that the audience, they didn't just go to the site themselves. They were picked up somewhere by a bus or by a small car, by a car, and then they were brought to this secret location, the antique shop. And to me, that is the performance already starts there. I'm reading it as that the audience are also made to experience this kind of being moved away from, right? Being in exile themselves, right? And it's a mix of puppets and actors. But what is interesting is that the Pak Wi and Ibu Widari are puppets, and so what you have actors, they are playing, let's say, government officials, right? So you have a separation between seemingly puppets and doing the protagonists, and then actors more like the antagonists, at least in their story. Right? And in an interview, Ria said that, so the story is based on a real story about Pak Wi, and then Ria invited Pak Wi to see the performance. But then one day Pak Wi just showed up in Jogja without telling them, so they couldn't really perform in front of him, because Ria once told him that, this performance will be complete when you have seen it. Right? So Pak Wi said, I don't want it to end. So I don't want to see the performance because you said that it will end once I see it. So the emphasis that the performance should go on, I think it talks about our own story, our own relationship to what happened in 1965, our collective memory, our collective responsibility of about what happened in 1965, right? And I think in this performance, you have an example of performative diasporic identity. In the scene when Pak Wi is finally given a letter, his passport back, so that he could return to Indonesia, right? It is actually acted out. So his Indonesianness, his being an Indonesian has to be performed, and in this case by the state, right? So he is interpolated, he is hailed again by the state. Yes, now you can have your Indonesian passport again. And I'm talking about, just quickly, displacement in two senses. So the two stories that I just presented to you are about displaced people. So in that sense, it's clear. But I'm trying to see also if we can also talk about it in the sense of Freudian displacement, meaning displaced anxieties, externalized and transferred or projected onto object centered elsewhere. So if I'm talking about Sri and her unhappy marriage, right? I'm reading that again as she is projecting her anxiety toward, her relationship with the host land, to the husband, right? I mean, sometimes she does injustice. I mean, she is too harsh to the husband. I mean, he deserves it maybe sometimes. But there are moments where I think it's just uncalled for, right? But I think that is because it's a displaced anxiety. So I'm reading it again as, Charles as this a metaphor embodying what is not good or what is not positive about the host land. While Michelle, the one who's kind of more like loving and stuff, is what pulling her. So what you have is this push and pull, you know, that she experiences in between, you know, Saputra, the idealized homeland, and the host land, the friends in her case. And in the story of Secangkir, Kopi, dari, Playa, I think it refers more to our displaced anxiety. I'm reading it more as the diasporic stories, particularly whose reasons are dispersal linked to our dark history as a nation. Perhaps they can be seen as our displaced anxieties. And it's really up to us whether, you know, we want to then find it as empowerment or just noise. I don't think that's what we want. So I want to end with suggestion for further research. If we can, anybody do a comparative study on different diasporic communities, right? You can compare the Moluccan diaspora with, let's say, the Suriname and migrant workers. What is really the impact of that reasons for and conditions of that first dispersal? How then it affects their relationship to the homeland, for example, right? And then also, I like what Bubakar suggests. To what extent and in what forms boundaries are maintained by second, third, and subsequent generations. I think that would be a very interesting project that we need to really seriously considering. And finally, about technology. I mean, now we have internet diaspora thing, right? But then how does technology enable diasporic communities to maintain ties in accelerated pace, and what the impact of that, right? Something that is unthinkable maybe less than 50 years back. And with that, I end my presentation and I welcome your question and suggestion. I'll go over time, sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elisabeth Arti Wulandari. So actually when Bu Arti kicks off by telling the narrative of your grandfather, then how he's fearful of place, to return to the place he can call home. May I ask you that this is also an extension of your fear?
Well, that home is about.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, Bu Arti has just explained to us how diasporic identity is rife with displacement. It's interpolatory and it is also performative. So now I welcome question and answer from Bu Arti from the audience. I will begin with the first 3 questions. Briefly raise your question and we will answer there and then. Is it right, Bu Arti? Okay. So shall I invite questions? One participation from you, please. Yes, the gentleman at the back. One. We are waiting for the second question from audience. From Father Hari, second question, and third. Okay, 2 questions first. Okay, would you please? Okay.
Good morning. My name is Ari from Universitas Pajajaran, Jatinangor, near Bandung, almost. So I was just wondering, when you were giving the explanation and the presentation about how diaspora or diasporic societies are defined, I was wondering who the subject is when, not the diasporic subject, but the subject that carries out the act of defining. From the definitions that you presented, you put forward on the screen, it seems like it's a self-defining act. While I think many times it's not a self-defining act, but rather its definition launched by someone else, by other people who are the subject of the enunciation, and the diasporic subject becomes the subject of the statement that that subject is making a definition of. So let's take, for example, the Chinese ethnic in Indonesia. Often it's not, I know my friends would not define themselves as being Chinese, but the society defines themselves as being Chinese, and therefore they, in a way, become Chinese diaspora. And I have also another problem in, it seems that in the examples that you gave, there's two kinds of diaspora. Your examples in Sebuah, Kapal, and Secangkir, Kopi, dari, Playa, it seems that they represent diaspora that's in a way of their diaspora because of their own accord, either because they choose to travel and liberate herself, or because they hold on to particular ideological principles and therefore they're exiled. But I'm thinking that the situation experienced by your father is quite different, because Wu Elisabeth's father is quite different, because if he's an indentured servant, then or indentured worker, then he's somewhere else, not because he wants to be somewhere else. And I'm wondering whether when there are movements like that, such displacements, whether that subject feels the same kind of longing and belonging and loyalty towards the homeland in the way voluntary diasporic subjects do, because from the very beginning, voluntary diasporic subjects are fully conscious of why they're somewhere else. But especially in the case of forced displacement, displaced peoples, especially, and also the second and the third generations, I don't think consciousness is not so much part of their being displaced. So I'd like to hear your comments about it.
Okay, thank you. Point taken. Yes, please, Father Hari, your question.
Okay, I think there is relation that's already mentioned by the first. There are two kinds of very different migration, or also diaspora. First is forced migration. It is not because I want, but because the situation just forced me to go, for example, Rohingya. And the second is intentional and voluntary migration. So that is, I take my own responsibility, the consequence, and also everything about that. So there are two different, very different. Can you just explain? Maybe there is a relation with that. In literature, in pada sebuah kapal, I think it is just voluntary, not because. Okay, can you just explain? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Ari and Father Hari. So, yeah, well, maybe I think, because I agree with you, because even though I mentioned about performing our diasporic identity as performative, right? But then I also later said that, I don't think that it's just that, right? Just because I perform myself a diasporic, therefore I am a diasporic subject, right? That's why I bring Althusser later on, right? With hailing, right? And in the story of Secangkir Kopi dari Playa, you see the state hails the subject, we back, right? And kind of, right, with the symbol with giving him his passport back. Now he is an Indonesian again, right? But I agree also, but it's not just about something what others sees us. I think there's always a negotiation, right? or we are talking about positionality, right, or positioning, it's not just about how I see it, how I see myself, but it's also how others see me. So, and there's always this negotiation that happens for all kinds of identity, including diasporic identity. And I take your point that there are, forced migration and voluntary migration. Although sometimes we may think that, oh, they chose to go there, right? We haven't really talked about cultural factor, right? It can be that, it may seem like it's totally voluntary, but deep when you analyze it further, there is a certain kind of involuntary element in there, right? Oh yeah, I chose to migrate to, let's say, Singapore because I have the money and stuff like that. But actually deep down, what is it that compels you to go there? Is there some cultural element in there, economic? And I'm not talking just about migrant workers, right? What if you feel like you are not so appreciated, for example, that you feel like you have to go somewhere? But I'm taking that back. But actually, just to correct, Secangkir Kopi dari Playa is about forced migration. The guy the Pak Wee has to stay in exile for 40 years because he is not allowed to go back, right? Because his passport is taken, right? Or because he is not acknowledged as an Indonesian. He was in the USSR in the first place to study, and then 1965 happened, right? So he always wanted to go back before that, but he could not. And Sri, I have a discussion with Nelly, right, about this. Isn't it her desire to always go abroad in search of, betterment for her own life, right? But at the same time, I want to argue that that's why I mentioned about her that she lost her virginity to Saputro. She always brings it up again and again, how in Javanese culture, once you sleep with someone else, when you are not a virgin anymore, then you are less of a woman, right? You are not desired. And she always brings it, right? When she talks about Carl, she mentioned, I talked to Carl about this, and Charles knew about this, and stuff like that. So she's very self-conscious about that. So I want to read that also as a sense of a force, that kind of like a force that compels her then to accept Charles and to go with him to Japan and then later on to France. I hope that answers the question.
10 o'clock on the dot, but I refuse to succumb with the tyranny of time, so I will go on with 2 questions. Being diasporic myself, so this really mobile. So 2 questions, please, from the audience. Yes, Elisabeth, our students from Tanzania, and 1 more, please, from this side. Yeah. Richard, welcome. It's like a coming home to you. These are also all students. Okay, 2 questions from Elisabeth and Richard, please.
Thank you very much, Ibu Elisabeth, for your presentation. Thank you for enlightening me about the diaspora and literature in general. Yeah, it is true that the concept of identity and hybridity in diaspora is something that cannot be avoided. That when people move from their original country to another one, they really face the problem of identity, cultural identity in general, and cultural hybridity. So you have given us the history of migration in different countries and more in Indonesia. So these characters in these literary texts, in performances, They are trying to express their previous experiences in relation to their present environment. They are trying to remember what they had in relation to what they're experiencing now. So, Ibu Elisabeth, I would like you to tell me how does literature help these people in diaspora? Leave alone telling us. Okay, thank you. So, leave alone telling us the history of these people and the experiences. Then, how does this literary text, performances, poems, and so forth help these people feel that it's no more about the identity, it's no more about hybridity, but feel that, okay, they accepting themselves. How does it help them? Does it only give out the wounds and give out the scars that they have in their hearts, or it also help them, and how? Thank you.
My question is, when we talk about textual mobilities, because you're the very first speaker of the conference, what do you think are the assumptions should we consider when we talk about this issue? For example, when we talk about the truthfulness of the experience presented in literature, because it is, when we talk about literature, it is not like when we talk about a history book. It is not a scientific report, but we talk about interpretation of reality. So for example, should we take for granted that any representation of diaspora, migration, and so on and so forth is true, or we should always relate it with reality? Because when we talk about this issue, there is always emotion that takes place that makes us, for example, really want to do something for these people. At least we empathize towards these people. So what kind of assumption should we take? And then I'm also thinking about, when we talk about literature, we also talk about conflict as one of the essential elements of for example, novels or short stories. You mentioned several issues about what can be classified as diasporic literature. Is it only when we talk about people living in different culture and then they feel that I still belong to my home culture? Is that you mentioned that it can be part of this kind of literature, but should we? I'm a bit curious whether we have to also consider. You show us the experience of diasporic people in United States of America when they had a conference, a talk with Barack Obama, and they only, quote unquote, presented the success of these people. Should we? So how far we should consider the diasporic experience of people who are successful, or we assume we only consider people who are experiencing a bad emotions, bad experience? And the last one, perhaps, should we also consider the political issues? Because everything that you mentioned seemingly are related to political issues.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah. Richard, could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, my name is Richard. I'm from Universitas Pelita Harapan, Tangerang.
Alumni, in fact.
Thank you, Elisabeth and Richard. So the question from Elisabeth, so how does literature help people in the diaspora to feel that it is okay to have hybrid identity? Or that literature can heal? I like to quote this Marxist philosopher theorist Herbert Marcuse in his book, this very thin book about the aesthetic dimensions. And he said that literature cannot change the world, but literature can change the men and the people who will then change the world. And I think that's the connection between Richard and Elisabeth. When you talk about emotions and stuff like that, right? Herbert Marcuse talks about sublimation. Right? Richard asked, are representations of the diaspora always true? I think you are, this is kind of like, if the answer is yes, then it's a kind of orthodox Marxist, right? There has to be like this one-way relation between literature and reality. And I don't think that I want to argue that. And Herbert Marcuse also is not arguing for that, right? There is a process of sublimation that a literary text undergoes, right? So I mean, I don't know then how exactly literature heals. I mean, I can give you examples, but I don't know how to do research on that. I can give you examples of, let's say, in South Africa, because Ethel Fugard is my favorite playwright, right? And he talked about performing this play in the 1970s in front of audience, and everybody stood up, and everybody raised their face, and everybody said like, yes, end with the apartheid era and stuff like that, right? So he saw the literature, he saw literature at work, right? It moved people so that they wanted to do something. But then later on, when he is old, he doesn't so much believe in that anymore. He said, I don't know if I mean, because it's very difficult to quantify that. So I don't know if I have a good answer how literature can heal. I mean, we can talk about, the aesthetic power and pleasing and stuff like that, but then in the end of the day, I think, again, literature cannot change the world. It's the men and the people, the men and the women who can change the world. How literature moves them, I think that's the answer. And I can only give you examples. I don't know if I can explain how it works, but I like to hear what you think in that. And Richard's question, I think,
So the conflict dimension in diasporic literature.
So, because all the examples I gave you are all political situations, right? Because to me, I mean, who said this? I think it's Roger Brubaker also identifies this several reasons, right? He talks about immigration, forced, exile, voluntary exile, and stuff like that. So even though the examples I gave you are kind of more forced migrations, there are other examples of voluntary, which I don't have the example right now in the top of my head, I can give you right away. What kind of conflicts are you referring to? Exactly, the political conflicts, because I think that's the examples I gave are all political conflicts, right? So are you expecting more like the non-political conflict? I mean, examples of what propels or what encourage people to migrate and to move and stuff like that? I'm sorry, I don't.
The association with the success story.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot the success story. No, I'm not saying that the story of diaspora has to be all about the bad story or the lost homeland and migrant workers being not happy and stuff like that. I mean, we have lots of stories of successful migrant workers also. So what I'm saying is that on that website, what you see is more about that. And so I wonder, where can we find also, is that also what I said about displaced anxiety? That is something that we still try to we refuse to kind of talk about that, particularly the diaspora stories that started from trauma, 1965, 1998. Where do we find that? Because I'm highlighting Congress Indonesian Diaspora Network because that's the organization that seems to have a lot of support from the government, right? And I mean, it started from just people, but then like Tony Patijalal, the ambassador of Indonesia in America, gave a lot of like support for that, and then and stuff like that. So I just want to see that this 1965 stories and 1998 stories are there too in the Diaspora Network. Yes.
Okay, I took 10 minutes out of your time, your coffee time, because we have Secangkir Kopi from Playa already, so we have the real coffee now. I don't want to summarize because that will reduce the depth and intensity of the talk. Remember that the talk doesn't change you, it is you who change the world, okay? So let's give a round of applause for our speaker of the day. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. I return to Joyce and Ugo.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give another big round of applause for our moderator and our presenter. Thank you very much, Bu Arti, for that insightful speech and insightful presentation. Now, we would like to give a token of appreciation for both the presenters and the moderator. To do so, we would like to invite Romo Innugroho to the stage and to give the appreciation.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we would have a 30 minutes coffee break before we commence to our next agenda, which is the first parallel session, and it's available in the lobby floor of this floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind all the participants to recheck their schedules and room where you will present your presentation. If you want to join any particular parallel session, do not forget to take the ticket for the session. All the parallel session tickets are available in the registration desk.
We would like to remind the participants that there will be 4 chambers for the presenter to present their presentation. It's in Kunjono Room, Kadarman Room, Rapat Personalia, and Realino Hall. Please kindly check your schedule and RLO will guide you to the room.
We would like to remind all the participants and invited guests that there will be a 1-hour lunch break from 12 until 1 p.m.